When Evelyn sold her house, she signed over every room except one, the shed. No one knew why. No one dared to ask, until a new family moved in and started hearing a ticking sound at night. A sound that always came at the same time, 1:17 a.m. What they discovered inside that shed wasn't just strange. It rewrote everything they thought they knew about love, memory, and time itself. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. The cottage sat quietly on the edge of a sleepy New England town, wrapped in ivy and silence. Its paint had long since peeled to gray, and the porch sagged like tired shoulders beneath the weight of forgotten years. Most folks didn't talk much about the woman who used to live there, Evelyn Harper. To the neighbors, she was more myth than a memory. Children dared each other to run past her front gate, and the mailman never once stepped on her porch, always slipping envelopes through the iron fence instead. Evelyn wasn't cruel. She was just untouched, untouchable. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't need help, didn't ask for company, and most curiously, she never let anyone near the old shed that stood behind a thicket of apple trees. Not even when storms knocked power lines down. Not even when winter bit through the roof. Over time, people learned to leave her be. But every evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the air held its breath, something strange would begin. A soft, steady ticking from the shed, so faint, so precise it sounded like a heartbeat carved in time. And Evelyn, she listened to it like it was the only thing keeping her alive. People had tried once. A group of women from the local church brought her soup and fresh-baked rolls during a bitter winter. But Evelyn never opened the door. They stood out there for a while, their arms full, their cheeks red from the cold, before one of them finally said, "She doesn't want saving," and they walked away. Her neighbor across the street, an old widower named Mr. Whitaker, offered to fix her roof after a summer storm peeled back the shingles like curled paper. He even brought his ladder and a new roll of tar. But Evelyn stepped out with her cane, didn't say a word, just shook her head once, the kind of no that ends all further conversation. When a county social worker showed up to check on her welfare, Evelyn didn't even open the door. She just stood behind the old storm window, resting her frail fingers on her cane like a queen behind glass, and slowly shook her head. The girl left without pressing. From that day on, no one knocked again. The shed behind her house, half buried in apple trees and shadow, seemed to vanish into the landscape over time. Its wood grayed to match the clouds. Its tin roof sagged and rusted. But every evening, without fail, as twilight slipped across the orchard, a soft ticking would begin, not frantic like clocks out of sync, not mechanical like factory timepieces. It was rhythmic, intentional, steady, like something was breathing in there, keeping perfect time. People started calling it the heartbeat of the orchard. Evelyn never explained it. She just made it clear that whatever lived in that shed, it wasn't for anyone else. One summer night, a group of high schoolers thought it would be funny to sneak onto her property. They were full of beer and bravado, stumbling under the weight of their own curiosity. One of them, a tall boy with an awkward walk and freckles across his nose, dared to press his eye to a crack in the shed's wall. He saw flickers of gold, rows of glinting brass, the shadows of wheels turning. But before he could say a word, the shed shuddered, and Evelyn's voice sliced through the night like the snap of a breaking bone. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply said, "Not another step." The kids ran. The next morning, a note was pinned to her gate. Just 3 words, written in sharp, deliberate letters. never come back. And no one ever did. The rumors grew after that. Some said the shed housed dangerous chemicals from her husband's old workshop. Others whispered of money stacks of it, hidden in the walls. The darker theories talked about bones, lost people, forgotten things. But truthfully, no one believed their own stories. Because the truth, the real truth, was stranger than anything they could invent. Inside Evelyn's home, time didn't run the way it did for the rest of us. Every wall, every shelf, every corner held a clock, mantel clocks, pocket watches, wall clocks ticking in uneven rhythms, but not a single one told the right time. They were all slightly off, some ahead, some behind, as if Evelyn couldn't bear the idea of perfect alignment, like she feared what might happen if they ever all ticked together. When someone once asked her years ago why the clocks didn't match, she had simply smiled and said, if they all agreed, that would be the end of everything. Nobody knew what she meant. Every night followed the same pattern. She'd light a small oil lamp in her kitchen, wind every single clock, one by one, with careful hands. Then she'd write a single line in a weathered leather journal by her bed. And finally, cane in hand, lamp flickering beside her, she would open the back door and stand still, just watching, listening. The ticking always started then, soft, measured, like a signal, like a reminder. And only when that first beat reached her ears would she blow out the lamp and retreat to her chair, sinking into it like someone falling into memory. There were fragments of the past scattered throughout her home, hidden under dust and time. A photograph above the mantel, a man in overalls with grease-stained fingers, smiling beside a wooden sign that read, Harper and Sons Clockmakers. He was young then. Before the fire, before the accident that took him, below the photo was a metal nameplate, warped by heat, the lettering almost unreadable. But Evelyn kept it polished anyway, as if the shine meant he was still close. Sometimes, neighbors saw her walking along the orchard edge. She'd bend slowly to pick up small pieces from the soil, a gear, a screw, a shard of glass, and tuck it into her coat pocket like treasure. A child once asked their mother what the old lady was doing. The mother simply said, "She's collecting time. Darling?" No one questioned it. Even the animals seemed to know. Stray dogs barked at the gate but never crossed. Birds avoided the shed's roof, and the orchard itself, it held its breath. The wind never sang there. Only the ticking did. When fall came, the apples dropped. But Evelyn didn't bother to gather them. They rotted underfoot, sweet and sour in the crisp air. She never flinched when wasps circled her porch, never cared if leaves clogged the stairs. The only thing that mattered was that the shed remained untouched. Her son hadn't visited in over 40 years, and from the look on her face when someone once asked, she preferred it that way. The last note he'd sent her was folded neatly in the journal by her bed. It read, simply, "Don't look for me." She hadn't. Years passed, measured not by calendars but by ticks and chimes and the whisper of falling apples. The village changed. Streetlights arrived. New families moved in. But Evelyn's house never bent to time. The porch sagged. The shutters cracked. But the rhythm, the pulse remained untouched. Until one night, Evelyn wound her clocks, wrote her line in the journal, stood at the door and whispered something only the dark could hear. She blew out the lamp and never lit it again. When the constable found her, she was sitting in her chair, her eyes closed, a faint smile softening her face. Around her, dozens of clocks had stopped. All at once, every single one frozen at the same exact moment. 17. And for the first time in over 50 years, the shed fell silent. But the story, it hadn't even begun yet. For nearly a year after Evelyn Harper's passing, the old cottage sat still, untouched and forgotten, like it had exhaled for the last time. Dust clouded the windows, the porch sagged deeper, the orchard ran wild, branches tangling with sky. No one mowed the grass, no one dared walk past the rusted gate, especially not near the shed. It stood at the back of the yard, half swallowed by bramble, its roof tilted, its frame cloaked in moss and shadow. But even in stillness, it loomed. And when the wind blew from the east, it carried with it a scent, faint, metallic, like rust and oil, and something older, the kind of smell that reminded people of things left behind. Neighbors avoided it. Some crossed the street when walking by. The ticking had stopped. Yes, but it was the silence that haunted them more. When Evelyn's family finally came a niece from the city, and her 2 grown sons, they treated the home like a museum of someone they'd never known. They whispered through the rooms, touched little, and refused to spend the night. The lawyer handed them the deed, and they began sorting what could be sold. An auctioneer catalogued the furniture, the silverware, the paintings, but when he reached the shed, he paused, pencil hovering above his clipboard. "You want that included?" The niece frowned and glanced toward the back orchard, where the shed's tin roof caught the faintest sliver of afternoon sun. Her reply was fast. Too fast. "No," she said. "That can stay locked. Aunt Evelyn was particular. Leave it alone." The auctioneer shrugged and moved on. And so the shed remained, sealed, untouched, untamed, until the Forresters came. Tom and Layla Forrester weren't from around here. They were city people, tired of honking horns and cramped elevators and the constant buzz of someone else's urgency. The house had been listed for well below its value. The listing had called it rustic, quaint, a charming fixer-upper with rich history. They didn't know about the whispers. They arrived with their 10-year-old daughter, Amelia, in a van bursting with boxes and mismatched furniture. Their eyes were full of possibility, their hands of plans. And when they stood before the slanted porch for the first time, Layla smiled and said, "It just needs a little love." The agent handed them a heavy ring of keys, each marked in faded handwriting. "Every door has its own," she said. "You're all set. Welcome home." Tom flipped through the keys as they stepped onto the gravel path. "What about the shed?" he asked, mostly out of curiosity. The agent paused. "Oh," she said, "that it's just a storage building, been locked for years. Probably nothing inside but dust and spiders." She changed the subject quickly. They spent the first day unpacking. Layla swept floors and peeled back dusty curtains. Tom tested old light switches and replaced what bulbs still worked. Amelia explored every inch her footsteps echoing on wood that creaked like whispers. That night, they sat down for their first dinner in the new house. The chairs wobbled, the silverware clinked, and for the first time in a long time, the house breathed differently, almost relieved. But when Tom lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the wind scraped gently against the windows, he heard it. A sound so faint he almost missed it. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't inside the house. It came from beyond the orchard, rhythmic, measured, familiar, though he couldn't place why. He closed his eyes and told himself it was just the wind, just the pipes, just the past. Morning came with birdsong and sunlight slanting through lace curtains. The ticking was gone. Layla made coffee in the quiet kitchen while Tom walked the edge of the backyard. The orchard was denser than he expected. Wild. Thick. Apples littered the grass like forgotten promises. And at the far end stood the shed. It was smaller than he'd imagined, but solid. Its wood weathered, its door sealed by an iron padlock thick with rust. He tugged at it gently. It didn't move. But the air around it held something strange, a scent of oil, of something once hot and alive. He noted it and walked away. That afternoon, while sorting through the property deed, Layla frowned. "Tom," she said, "this doesn't mention the shed." He looked over her shoulder. The paperwork listed the house, the orchard, even the old well, but no shed. "Huh," he muttered. "Weird." They let it go. But something about that omission itched at the back of his mind. Days passed. Amelia made friends with the local kids. Layla painted the kitchen walls a soft sage green. Tom fixed the porch railing and pulled weeds from the garden. The house settled under their care. But the ticking, it returned. Not every night, but often enough to make Tom listen harder. Sometimes it faded in gently, like it had always been there. Other times it arrived like a breath being held, then released. He told himself it was the house's memory adjusting to new people, until Amelia came in one evening with dirt on her jeans and said, "There's a box behind the shed." Layla looked up from her book. "What kind of box?" "A small one," Amelia said, "with flowers painted on the lid. But it's nailed shut." Layla smiled gently. "Let's not play near there." "Okay, sweetheart, just in case." Amelia nodded. But she kept looking out the window, as though something out there was waiting for her to come back. That night, the ticking grew louder, sharper. Tom sat up in bed, wide-eyed, as it pulsed through the walls, not inside, but underneath, like the ground itself remembered a rhythm long forgotten. He crossed to the window, peering into the dark, and for a moment, between the branches he swore he saw it, a flicker of gold, a glint of motion, and the outline of the shed, breathing. He told Layla about it in the morning, the sound, the shimmer, the feeling like something was alive back there. She listened, half awake, stirring her coffee with a slow, absent rhythm. "Old houses breathe," she said gently. "You're just not used to the silence." Tom smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. It didn't feel like silence. He murmured. It felt deliberate. He walked out to the shed again that afternoon. Alone. The grass was damp, heavy with dew and memory. He circled the building slowly this time, dragging his fingers across the warped wood. The padlock still hung thick and unmoving. But in the dirt below it, faint marks traced a path, dragged lines, like something had been pulled across the ground and then hidden again. They were barely visible, like a whisper written in dust. He knelt, touching the trail, cold, undisturbed, but recent. A few nights later, the ticking changed. It didn't sneak in gently like before it arrived with purpose, louder, layered, as though multiple clocks had come alive all at once. Dozens, maybe hundreds, beating in quiet unison. Tom sat up in bed, frozen. 1:17. He checked the time without thinking. Always 1:17. The next morning, he mentioned the hour to the mailman, a local man in his 60s, with a sun-leathered face and kind, suspicious eyes. At the mention of that specific time, the man paled slightly. "She kept that hour," he muttered. "Evelyn. Never changed her clocks. Said it was important." Tom asked what that meant, but the man only shook his head and walked off without another word. That night, Layla heard the ticking too. It came through the floorboards, through the glass, through the walls. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a breath behind the walls, a slow, careful heartbeat somewhere just beyond the orchard. She sat up beside Tom, her voice barely a whisper. "You were right," she said. "Something's down there." After that, The ticking became part of their nights. Sometimes it would start early, before midnight. Other times, just as the hour turned. But no matter when it began, it always settled into the same rhythm, and it always ended in the same hush. A silence so complete, it felt heavier than sound. Tom couldn't ignore it anymore. On the last Sunday of September, he stood in the backyard just after sunset. The sky had turned the color of bruised peaches, and the trees in the orchard swayed gently in the wind. The shed waited. He stepped forward. "It's just a building," he whispered to himself. But he didn't believe it. The lock glinted in the fading light. Old, stubborn, silent. Behind the door, something waited. Time, perhaps? A few nights later, Amelia said something at breakfast that made the room go still. "Did you hear Grandma's clocks last night?" she asked, spooning cereal into her bowl without looking up. Tom froze. Layla's hand went limp on her coffee mug. "What did you say?" she asked. Amelia shrugged. "Grandma. The lady who used to live here. I heard her walking in the garden. The clocks were talking to her." Tom and Layla exchanged a glance filled with silent panic. "Where did you hear that name?" Layla asked. "Barely breathing." "I didn't," Amelia replied with a shrug. "I just knew." That night, neither of them slept. Around 1:15 a.m., the ticking began. Soft, precise, familiar. Tom got out of bed and walked to the back window. The orchard was silver with frost. The moon hung low like a lantern over forgotten things. For a moment, everything was still. Then, movement. A pale flicker. A shape almost human gliding through the trees. It didn't walk. It drifted. He leaned forward, but by the time his eyes focused, it was gone. The next morning, Tom found footprints near the shed. Small, barely pressed into the earth. Too big for Amelia, too small for either of them. And fresh. Layla insisted they call someone, the police, the realtor, anyone. But Tom hesitated. "What would I say?" he asked. "That ghosts are leaving tracks in our yard." He didn't sleep the next night either. Instead, he set up his phone by the window, pressed record, left it facing the orchard. In the morning, he played it back. Static. Not wind, not animals, just static. Until the very end. There, beneath the hiss, a pulse, a beat. Tick, tick, tick. But it wasn't mechanical. Not anymore. It was organic. Measured, like a voice trying to speak without words. Amelia had begun drawing clocks. Dozens of them. Gears. Pendulums. Faces without numbers. All connected by thin, looping lines that looked like veins. "You've never seen the inside of a clock," Layla said gently one afternoon, sorting through the pages. Amelia just smiled. "I don't need to." A few days later, Tom woke to a dream. He was in the orchard. The trees around him were moving, ticking in rhythm, each leaf trembling like the hand of a clock. In the distance, the shed opened slowly, and a warm golden light spilled out across the grass. When he approached, the door swung wide. Inside, 1,000 clocks ticked in perfect unison. Each one whispered his name. He woke drenched in sweat, the sheets clinging to his skin. His watch had stopped. 1:17. Tom had reached his limit. That night, after Amelia had gone to bed and Layla drifted into an uneasy sleep, he slipped out the back door with a flashlight in one hand and a crowbar in the other. The air was cold enough to bite. The orchard silent but watching. He crossed the yard in quick, determined strides, his breath forming short ghosts in the dark. The shed waited for him still, breathless. The ticking had already begun. Not like before. Now it sounded urgent, heavy, layered with something new, a grinding, like rusted gears waking from decades of sleep. Tom stopped in front of the door. The padlock glinted under the flashlight beam, motionless but mocking. Without hesitation, he raised the crowbar. The first strike echoed like thunder. The second sent a shiver through the orchard. On the third, the lock snapped, and the door groaned open. A rush of air poured out thick, metallic, and strangely sweet. It didn't smell like decay. It smelled like memory, like time, like a room that hadn't exhaled in years. Inside, the beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness and landed on the impossible. Clocks. Hundreds of them. Wall clocks, mantel clocks, pocket watches hanging by their chains, wrist watches nailed to beams, some pristine, others half-eaten by rust. And every single one was ticking, not at random, together, in rhythm. The sound was immense, a heartbeat made of metal and breath. He stepped inside, half in awe, half in fear. The floor creaked beneath him as he approached the long workbench that spanned the far wall. Tools were scattered across it, brass gears, oiled rags, shattered glass domes, papers too, yellowed and curling at the edges. One small box sat at the center of the table. It was simple, wooden, its lid engraved with 4 words. "For those time forgot?" His hand trembled as he opened it. Inside were names, dozens of them, scrawled in careful handwriting on slips of paper. Next to each one was a tiny brass tag, each etched with a time some familiar, some oddly precise. But 117 appeared more than once. Tom's throat tightened. Something stirred behind him. He turned quickly, the flashlight swinging toward the back wall, and stopped. A shape stood there, cloaked in an old gray sheet, tall and rectangular. He approached slowly, pulled the fabric back with shaking fingers. It was a coffin, old, wooden, reinforced with tarnished iron bands. Dust covered most of it except for the center, where the surface gleamed slightly, as if someone had touched it not long ago. His knees went weak. He dropped the flashlight. It rolled, spinning the light across the walls, where hundreds of ticking faces stared back at him like watchers of time. And then he saw it. Near the floorboards, a seam. Barely visible. A small metal handle embedded into the wood. Tom crouched. His hands moved without permission. He pulled. With a reluctant groan, the floor opened. A narrow stairwell led down, swallowed by darkness. Cold air rushed up, heavy with earth and something older, something buried. He should have walked away. He should have called someone. But something deep within pulled him forward. He descended slowly, one step at a time. The walls pressed in close, damp and humming. The sound of the clocks above faded as he entered the heart of the house. A small underground room revealed itself. Stone walls, dirt floor, shelves filled with jars of gears and tiny bones of broken watches. But it was the centerpiece that stole his breath. 3 enormous clocks, unlike any he'd ever seen. They stood like monuments, their pendulums swinging in perfect unison, not mechanical, but alive, breathing. Beneath them sat a small table, a wooden stool, and on that table, a photograph. It showed a man and a woman young, smiling, grease on their fingers. Evelyn Harper and her husband. Behind them, shelves filled with half-built clocks. The photo was decades old, but Evelyn's eyes looked just like Amelia's. Bright, certain, undeniably alive. Beside the photo were stacks of journals. Tom opened the first one. The handwriting was delicate, precise. He built them for everyone he loved, each one a heartbeat in brass. Another line. I told him they would outlive us. I didn't realize how right I was. The final entry in bold, heavy ink. The fire took his body, but not his hands. I kept what remained. I made him whole again. Tom felt the world spin around him. He turned back to the coffin. Its surface now seemed to shimmer in the dim light. There were fingerprints on it. Fresh. The air vibrated with a pulse that wasn't his own. Tom stumbled backward, his heart in his throat. Above him, something creaked. Footsteps. And then Layla's voice. "Tom." He raced up the stairs, pushing the hatch open. Layla stood in the doorway of the shed, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Why?" she began. "Why are all the clocks ticking?" She didn't have to finish. Her gaze fell on the coffin. Her breath caught. Tom stepped beside her, his voice barely a whisper. "It's him," he said. "Her husband. The one who died in the fire." Layla looked around the room, taking in the ticking walls, the scattered papers, the open hatch. "We have to call someone," she said. This isn't right." But before they could move, a chime rang out. One long, low tone that seemed to shudder through the wood. Every clock froze. The hands aligned. 1:17. And then silence. Perfect. Eternal. The light flickered. The air thickened. And for a moment, Tom thought he saw something beneath the coffin's wood. A shift. A breath. Then nothing. The ticking returned. Slower this time, like an exhale after a long prayer. Tom turned to Layla. "We're leaving," he said. And for once, she didn't argue. They ran back to the house, slamming the door behind them, their breath sharp and shallow in the cold silence. Tom locked the deadbolt without thinking, then stood motionless, staring through the peephole as if something might follow. Nothing did, but the air around them felt different, pressurized, tense, as though the house itself had heard what they had done and was now holding its breath. Layla paced the living room, her hands trembling as she whispered, "We weren't supposed to see that. We weren't supposed to open it." Tom didn't answer. He couldn't. The image of those clocks, hundreds of them ticking in perfect rhythm inside a shed that had been sealed for decades. It played on a loop in his mind. That night, neither of them slept. Even Amelia, usually so light and carefree, seemed quieter the next morning. She sat at the breakfast table drawing a new picture, a man made of gears, his arms shaped like pendulums, his heart an open clock face. Ticking. Tom gently took the sketch from her and asked, "Sweetie, where did you see this?" Amelia didn't look up. "He walks in the orchard sometimes," she said softly. "I think he's lonely." Tom's fingers tightened around the paper. Something had changed. Not just in the shed, but in them. In him. Over the next few days, the ticking returned to its familiar rhythm every night at 1:17. But now, instead of fear, Tom felt something else. Responsibility. He began returning to the shed. Not with fear, but with reverence. He oiled the rusty hinges, reorganized the tools on the workbench, cleaned the dust off the clocks, one by one. The air inside no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a request. A plea? Not for secrecy, but for care. The shed wasn't a tomb. It was a memory that refused to die. Layla noticed the shift. She watched as Tom spent longer hours among the trees, collecting small things from the ground, old springs, metal fragments, even shattered pieces of watch glass. Sometimes she followed him, and together they walked the perimeter in silence, picking up forgotten parts and tucking them into their pockets. "One afternoon," she whispered, "I think you're becoming her." Tom didn't ask who. He knew she meant Evelyn. Amelia, too, had changed. She began to hum softly in the evenings, little melodies that matched the rhythm of the clocks in uncanny ways. She no longer feared the orchard instead. She treated it like a sanctuary. Sometimes, Tom found her standing near the shed with her eyes closed, her hand gently pressed against the wall as though feeling for a heartbeat. "Can you hear it?" she asked once. Tom nodded. "I think I can." Layla still struggled. The logic in her rebelled against everything they'd seen, everything they were becoming a part of. But even she couldn't deny the peace that came with the ticking. She began tending the overgrown orchard, pruning trees, clearing old brush. She planted flowers by the path to the shed, bright little bursts of color that slowly softened the space. It was as if the land itself was healing. One evening, Tom returned to the shed and found something he hadn't placed there, a brand new clock. Small and unfinished, lying on the workbench, its casing was brass, its pendulum carved with a faint outline of an apple tree. No hands, no numbers, just an engraving across the face. For those not yet remembered. He turned to Layla later that night and asked, "Did you?" She shook her head. "No, I haven't touched anything." But Amelia, from the top of the stairs, said quietly, "It was always meant for you, Daddy." So Tom finished it. Not from skill, he'd never built a clock before in his life, but from instinct. The pieces fit together like they already knew where to go. When he placed it on the shelf beside the others, it ticked immediately. Soft. Steady. Like it had always belonged. That night, at 1:17, the chime rang out again. But it was different. Fuller. Layered. Alive. It no longer sounded like a haunting. It sounded like home. From that moment, Tom understood. This wasn't a place to fear. It was a place to keep, to protect, to remember. He began reading Evelyn's journals again this time, slowly, carefully. Each page was a confession, a prayer, a record of love so strong it had refused to let time erase what fire had tried to take. He wasn't just gone, she'd written. He was scattered in ash, in brass, in rhythm, so I stitched him back together in sound. Tom felt tears rise. He understood now why Evelyn had lived the way she did, why she never let anyone near, why the clocks mattered. She hadn't tried to resurrect the past. She'd tried to remember it well enough that it could speak, and now the burden had passed to him. Or maybe not a burden at all. Maybe it was a gift. A few weeks later, the villagers began to ask questions. They noticed the light glowing faintly from the shed at night, heard the soft chime carried on the wind, saw Amelia humming in the garden with a peace no child should carry so quietly. One old man from the village knocked on their door and asked gently, "Is it true they still tick?" Tom nodded. The man didn't ask to see. He only said, "Good." They should never stop. That evening, Tom stood by the shed alone. The moonlight pooled at his feet. Inside, the clocks ticked their familiar song. And he whispered, "I'll keep them going. I promise." The shed answered with silence. But in that silence, Tom felt something stir, not fear, not sorrow, gratitude. The clocks had accepted him, and Evelyn, wherever she was. He hoped she knew her rhythm still lived. In the weeks that followed, Tom fell into a rhythm that felt older than his own life. Each morning, he'd step into the shed just after sunrise. The warm scent of oil and wood greeted him like an old friend. He would wind the clocks slowly, one by one, his fingers learning the delicate resistance of each mechanism. Some clicked loudly, proudly. Others ticked like they were whispering secrets only he could hear. He polished the glass, brushed away dust from the brass faces, and gently nudged stuck pendulums until they found their breath again. It became a ritual not of maintenance but of reverence. He wasn't just keeping the clocks alive. He was keeping them alive. Layla no longer flinched at the sounds in the night. She stopped asking if they should leave. Instead, she began spending quiet hours in the orchard, pruning branches Evelyn had long ignored. She planted a circle of white flowers around the shed's door, the petals opening wide under moonlight. "Everything here deserves care," she told Tom one morning, "even the things that stopped growing." Amelia changed the most. She grew quieter, but not withdrawn. It was as if something in her had deepened. She began building things with bits of metal and wood she found in the yard, tiny sculptures that ticked softly, as though imitating the shed's rhythm. Once, her teacher at school said she had an uncanny sense of balance and timing. Amelia just smiled and said, "My grandma taught me." She'd never met Evelyn, of course. But maybe she didn't need to. The house itself changed too. Sunlight seemed warmer. The silence less hollow. And at night, just before 1:17, the walls would grow still as if the entire house were holding its breath in anticipation. Then, the chime. Always soft, always steady, but somehow different each time. It wasn't just marking the hour. It was speaking. Not in words, but in memory. One day, while reorganizing shelves in the shed, Tom found a small plaque mounted behind one of the wall clocks. He hadn't seen it before. Perhaps it had only just revealed itself. It was engraved with names. Dozens. Many he didn't recognize. A few he remembered from tombstones in the village cemetery. Next to each name was a symbol, a small, carved clock hand, each pointing to a different hour. At the bottom, in faint lettering, were the words, "They all keep time here." That evening, Tom and Layla stood outside the shed, hands clasped, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The clocks had become their language, their legacy, and their inheritance. That night, after the chime sounded, Tom stayed in the shed longer than usual. He sat by the workbench, Evelyn's journals laid out before him. He read not as a stranger, but as a student absorbing her words like scripture. "Time doesn't forget." One entry read, "It only waits to be remembered." Another, "If the world moves too fast, let this room be a place where nothing is lost." He closed the book, his heart full. He finally understood. Evelyn hadn't built the clocks to stop time. She had built them to give time a voice. And now, through Tom, it continued speaking. The shed no longer belonged to her. It belonged to them all. 1 week later, Tom entered the shed and found another clock on the workbench. Small, unfinished, as always. But this time, he knew what to do. He assembled it carefully, with Amelia sitting beside him. She handed him tools without asking, as though she'd built 100 clocks before. When it was complete, he placed it on the shelf. It ticked immediately. The chime that night was unlike any they'd heard before. It echoed with joy. And something else welcome. News began to spread through the village. Neighbors whispered about the strange warmth that lingered near the orchard. A few brave souls stood by the fence just before 1:17, curious. They didn't always hear the chime, but when they did, it stayed with them, a sound that made them feel, just for a moment, remembered. Tom never invited anyone inside the shed, not because it was a secret, but because it was sacred. "This isn't for tourists," he told one neighbor. "It's for the forgotten." And that was enough. Years passed. Seasons shifted. The clocks never stopped. Each spring, Layla planted new flowers near the door. Each winter, Tom oiled the hinges and wound every pendulum with the same care he had the first day. And Amelia, she grew. She studied mechanical engineering in college, surprising no one. Her projects always seemed to breathe as if they had hearts beneath their gears. She wrote papers about temporal empathy and memory-based design, though her professors couldn't quite grasp what she meant. But she understood. She always had. One snowy morning, a letter arrived. From the county clerk's office, enclosed was a page, old and yellowed. A note written in Evelyn's delicate, determined hand, never mailed, but found among her legal records. It read, "If there is anyone left who hears them, promise me only this. Do not let them stop, for when they do, all that we were will vanish into silence." Tom framed it and hung it above the workbench. That night, just after the chime, he stood in the doorway of the shed and whispered back, "We're still listening." He swore the clocks answered him. Anyone can remember the past, but only a few have the courage to carry it forward. Years after stepping into Evelyn Harper's old home, Tom Forrester no longer questioned the ticking in the shed. He had become part of it, and now, as twilight gathered once more over the quiet orchard, it wasn't Tom who wound the clocks. It was Amelia. The little girl who once heard clocks in her sleep now stood at the workbench, hands steady, heart calm. Not to fix what was broken, but to build what came next. A new timepiece rested in front of her, engraved not with a name, but with a promise. For those yet to be remembered, she understood now the rhythm wasn't just history, it was hope, and every soul who had ever been forgotten was now being heard again, one quiet tick at a time. Because for Amelia, and for those who would come after, memory isn't something we keep in silence. It's something we pass on. The end. Up next, 2 more hauntingly beautiful stories that will stay with you. Click to keep the rhythm going, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe love can outlive even time itself.